Riding the Currents of Change, the Combahee River Collective. The 1960s and 70s were a time of revolution. The civil rights movement was in full force and the feminist movement was coming to its feet. People could express and protest about their problems, and lawmakers were finally listening. A true time for change, seen through the March on Washington, the First Women's March, and so much more. People of color and women were expressing their problems loudly and creating real change, seen through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and decisions like Roe v. Wade. It seemed that everyone was finally being heard and seen. Even though on the surface everything was looking for the better, I wondered, did everyone feel represented? Was everyone being heard and seen? What about the people dealing with both racial and sexual discrimination? Were they included in both conversations? Unfortunately, despite the many advances at this time, the answer to these questions were a resounding no. Thousands of Black women in America felt immensely unheard and ignored in the movements they were supposed to be represented in. Some Black women decided to take matters into their own hands and decided they would make change for themselves. But what did they do? And how did they do it? What was their answer to being underrepresented by the two biggest movements of their time? Their answer came with the Combahee River Collective, made specifically to empower Black women, helping create and empower a new section of feminism. In this episode, we'll talk about the Combahee River Collective and its impact on modern-day racial and gender movements and legislation. To understand the creation and the need for the Combahee River Collective, it's important to look at the context of this time. Though the collective was created in 1974, civil rights and feminist movements had been on the rise for over a decade. After the abolition of slavery, Black people were subject to many kinds of abuse, like racial segregation and restrictions on voting polls, especially in the southern states of the country. This continued for over a century, and while Black people tried to fight back against this oppression throughout that time, all this effort really came to fruition in the late 1950s and 60s. During this time, people were really coming together and fight for equality. The rise of civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement really came into full swing, and protests and marches became really prevalent in the US. This all compiled into the signing of actual legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Brown v. Board of Ed, and more. These monumental pieces of legislation really changed the lives of Black people all over the United States, but there was still something missing within the movement. Although women played pivotal roles in the success of civil rights, much of this movement was male-dominated. This was reinforced by the strict gender roles of the 1960s. This included women's efforts being overshadowed or gender discrimination within the movement. MLK himself believed that women were meant to be homemakers, while it was the men's job to protest on the streets. Furthermore, despite the vast contributions women made to the civil rights movement, they were often left, forgotten, or ignored. An example of this is Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, igniting the Montgomery bus boycotts, which really helped start the civil rights movement. Parks' story is known by every American, yet she was never given a leading position within the movement, and when Park recalled marching from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights in 1965, she said most young people didn't know who she was. The leaders of the civil rights movement were immensely important and impactful for America, but some of their inherent ideas left out Black women and their struggles. Black women faced similar problems in the feminist movement that began to grow in the 1960s. While women in America had been fighting for their rights since Seneca Falls in 1848, in the 60s and 70s, a new wave of feminism came to the Western world. This was created to fight back against the ideals of the 1950s, where women were just meant to be mothers and homemakers. This new wave of feminism was based in the idea that capitalist ideals suppressed women, and this really opened the eyes of many women in the 60s and 70s. These revelations were directly reflected in society, seen through the increased divorce rate and the increase of women in university and the job market. Women were making strides towards equality more than ever before. Feminists fought and got certain legislation designed to help all women, like Title IX, Roe v. Wade, and the attempted Equal Rights Amendment. Feminists like Betty Friedan started organizations like the National Organization for Women. A new tide was coming where women were more than just homemakers, with a real influence in academia and work culture. Women were more outspoken, educated, and independent. But once again, there was something missing. But just like the civil rights movement, the feminist movement failed to address the concerns of Black women. Many people within the feminist movement were white and middle class, and were oblivious and ignorant to the issues Black women faced, which ultimately led to Black women to be uncomfortable within the growing feminist movement. Many feminists were colorblind and assumed integration would come naturally. They did not specifically cater to Black women at all, as they did not realize how different their experiences were. Many white feminists were also from the North and did not understand the severity of racism and racial segregation, which mostly plagued the South. In general, feminists could not sympathize with Black women and put little importance and weight on race. Many white women also did not understand the importance of class and how it affected Black women and Black Americans in general. To be clear, most feminists weren't racist, but they failed to understand the needs of Black women, and when radical feminists did deal with civil rights, they dealt with racism as a whole. Although neither the civil rights or feminist movement inherently tried to leave out Black women, their focus and lack of knowledge on the issues Black women faced made Black women feel unwelcome and underrepresented in both these movements. In the 1970s, Black feminists began creating their own organizations to address their concerns. This leads us to the Combahee River Collective in 1974 Boston. Named after the river Harriet Tubman used to free hundreds of African American slaves from the South, the founders of the collective were inspired by Tubman and her influence as a Black woman. The collective, CRC for short, was actually originally part of a bigger organization, the National Black Feminist Organization, or the NBFO, and directly tried to address the concerns of African American women. Although this organization was meant to include a previously excluded group of people in the conversation of social justice, many people still felt left out. Some issues people believed were ignored included classism and queer rights. This discourse was compiled into the Combahee River Collective. The CRC vowed to acknowledge sexual identities and push for desegregation and the end of police brutality. They allowed people on the outskirts of society to have a conversation and share their experiences to make their lives better. The CRC coined the phrase identity politics and highlighted how important one's race, gender, and sexual identity is to their political beliefs and values. The CRC also stated that if one wanted to get justice, they had to fight for it, and this is really displayed in the way the group worked and the ideals they pushed. The Combahee River Collective also introduced intersectionality and wrote in their statement, "Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allow us to continue our struggle." Never before did a group address both the troubles of race and gender, and so the collective realized that they had to be the ones to create the change. The CRC's most important achievement, however, was creating their own space where they could express themselves freely. Even though the Combahee River Collective only lasted 6 years from 1974 to 1980, their ideas and viewpoints on social justice are seen now in recent movements and legislation. The idea of identity politics, for example, is all over modern-day politics. Gender, race, and class and sexual orientation are such a big part of how people cast their ballots throughout all elections. Their idea of intersectionality plays such a huge role in the way people identify themselves today. Although the CRC didn't pass any legislation directly, their foundational ideas and values have helped shape public policy in the modern day. They immensely increased social awareness of the issues regarding Black women and changed the feminist movement to be more intersectional. The CRC not only informed people about the real-life struggles a group went through that were previously ignored, but introduced a new idea of what it meant to be equal. CRC's unwavering commitment to intersectionality and collective liberation made them a beacon of inspiration, reminding us that the struggle for justice and equality is something shared that continues to shape our world today. Hope you guys enjoyed the video on the Combahee River Collective. Please like and subscribe and hit the bell. Thank you so much for watching.